Hi, and welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. Joining us today, of course, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation. And we have a special guest here with us today, Carter Wrenn, author of The Trail of the Serpent. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You know, we've been talking a lot about what a pivotal year this has been in 2024 in North Carolina particularly, but state and national politics. It's been really something that we're going to be looking back in history and putting some perspective on what this means, this pivotal time in state politics, in national politics. I wanted to get your thoughts on what's your thought on how 2024 fits into our historic narrative?
Well, politics doesn't mold people. It mirrors them.
Sure.
And you see changes in what people are concerned about. When Reagan was elected, we were in the Cold War, and we lost the war in Vietnam. And all those people who lived through World War II, when they saw Russian tanks rolling into Saigon, it shocked them. And it frightened them because they thought the Soviet Union's more powerful than we are, we're losing the Cold War. That created a river of people in American politics that elected Reagan. He was one of those people. And that river really ruled politics until the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. And then the fear went away, the river went away, and politics changed. And we rolled into another era for 30 years. Then Trump was elected in 2016. And I think that was the start of a third era. And I think that you could track a lot of reasons for that. Populism's one. The corruption in Washington is one. The economic problems with the global economy is one. But I think we're now sort of 8 years into the third era we've seen.
Were you surprised to have Trump come back in 2024 and win it all?
A little bit.
Okay.
You know, the problem we now have with election, we didn't used to have. You looked at the two candidates, and there was usually one you thought, he's good. You may not have just liked the other one, but you had one you preferred. In 16, 20, and 24, for undecided voters, now Republicans love Trump, Democrats love Biden, but for independents, they didn't like either choice. They didn't like Hillary, they didn't like Trump, they didn't like Trump, they didn't like Biden. And so they had to make a Hobson's choice. And you never know how one of those works. You know, I was in the first election I was ever in, we had like that was when Helms ran against Hunt. But it's not a shock that Trump won, but you just didn't know.
Sure.
And that in the end it tilted his way. It was they decided, you know, they weren't crazy about him, but he was better than Harris, and so now he's back in power.
Sure. Sure.
Donna mentioned that you're the author of The Trail of the Serpent, which is your memoir.
Yeah.
For those who don't know you, you have been involved in North Carolina politics for a number of years, played a major role in the growth of the Republican Party in North Carolina. Why did you decide now was a good time to kind of put all those recollections together and give people this book?
Back during COVID, when they had shutdowns, I had a friend in New York, and he was locked down a lot more than we were here. And he's a liberal, but he used to call me when he was shut down, and he loved telling stories about politics and hearing stories about politics. And finally, one day he said to me, you know, you got to put all those stories in a memoir. Well, we were locked down. There wasn't a lot going on. So I thought, yeah, I'll try that. And it took me almost 3 years to write it. But I finally got it done and sent it to a publisher, and he said yes, and there it was.
That's great.
What are some of the stories from that time that you think are particularly relevant to people now? You look at it and go, oh yeah, that's what we were dealing with back in the 70s, 80s, or 90s.
Well, I think that I think that I'll give you an example. Reagan fought Tip O'Neill for years. They didn't agree on anything. But when Reagan was wounded, Tip O'Neill was one of the first people to go to the hospital. And when he walked in the room, he knelt down by Reagan's bed and they prayed together. They had a level of mutual respect that was not unusual back then. There were a lot of people in politics I fought with, Gary Pierce, you mentioned, disagreed with, but you treated them with mutual respect. When you were meeting with them, you didn't call them names and abuse them. And that's gone out the window now. You know, there's hardly any mutual respect. It's all about name calling and attacking. And the other big change has to do with just telling lies. I got into politics in '74, right at the end of the Watergate scandal. Nixon won a huge landslide in '72. He got caught on tape telling a lie about Watergate and had to resign. Today, politicians tell the lies every day, dozens of times. Nobody cares anymore. Old men my age who taught their children don't tell lies now cheer politicians who tell lies. That's a big change.
What do you think? I do feel like we've lost that civility and some of that basic moral compass. Is there anything you attribute that to?
I think the decline in religion is a big part of it. Cultural changes. You know, look at the rise of reality TV.
Right.
That's not about treating people with courtesy. It's a sort of a hammering routine. But I think that primarily you've got to look at when people cheer lies and cheer insults, politicians are going to lie and insult people. And I think you have to track those changes back to culture and religion.
That is.
You mentioned getting into politics in '74.
Yeah.
Nixon had the landslide. Watergate basically wipes out much of the Republican Party in this state and other places.
Yeah.
At that time, could you have said, you know, in 40 years, Republicans are going to run this state? I mean, would you have even thought of that?
Well, back then, you know, Helms was elected, Jesse Helms was elected in '72. Hadn't been a Republican senator elected in the 20th century. North Carolina, like most southern states, had been dominated by Democrats for years. And so even in '74, I wasn't sure Republicans were ever going to dominate politics. And what happened was, whereas most people in North Carolina were Democrats, most were also conservative. And what Reagan brought into politics was the conservative ideology. And he moved that, or he didn't move it, but with Reagan it moved to the Republican Party. And the rise in that conservative Republican Party, that laid the foundation for Republican success. And the demographics have changed a lot, of course, over the years, so that today we're just a completely balanced. I mean, most states are red or blue. We're one of the few that's just completely balanced. We can go either way. We went for Trump this time again, narrowly. And at the same time, you elected Josh Stein by 15 points, and Mark Robinson, who was a Trumpster, lost. So we're a very even keel state. It's unusual.
It seems like where we do a Democrat at the state level, we do Republican president.
It's gone on for years. I've never quite understood that. But, you know, Jim Hunt got elected 4 times.
Right.
And I think in every one of those years, except the first one, the Republicans won the presidential race.
There's a federalism foundation there that we are.
Well, I think people pay a lot more attention to presidential races. You get a lot more information about them. And I also think that management I mean, a Senate race, a presidential race, issues enter into it a lot. Governor's race is less so. And I think the Democrats have been better at winning governor's campaigns and had better candidates than we've had.
Sure, sure.
You mentioned the most popular Democrat that anyone alive in North Carolina has ever known, Jim Hunt.
Right.
But you were part of the one big election that he lost. I'm sure there's some good stories in the memoir about that.
Well, I'll tell one of them. First poll we took in that campaign, Hunt had been elected governor twice then, and he ran for Senate against Jesse. We polled 2 years before the election. That's how concerned we were. And Jesse was 25 points behind Jim Hunt. Jesse was upside. The pollster, Arthur Finkelstein, when he came in and briefed us on the poll, he started out and he laughed and said, "I've only seen this twice before. But Jesse is more unpopular than popular. More people disliked him than liked him." And Tom Ellis asked him, "So well, is that about issues?" He said, "No, it's about character. It's not what he believes they dislike, it's who he is." And we spent a year doing what we'd always done in campaigns. We hammered Hunt, spent $4 million, liberal versus conservative. Got nowhere. We actually only went up 4 points in the polls, and it appeared where we spent $4 million, Hunt spent nothing. And then in December of '83, David Price, who was head of the Democrat Party, did a radio ad attacking Jesse for voting for the tobacco tax. And we thought, well, we got to answer that. We can't ignore it. And we were trying to save money because everybody was going to announce in January we're going to have to spend $1 million. And we did a 10-second ad in a rush. And it was nothing, but it was Jesse Helms' voice on a screen with words crawling over it. And then he said, "I'm Jesse Helms. I oppose the Panama Canal giveaway. Where do you stand, Jim?" You couldn't put liberal versus conservative in a 10-second ad. And he did 3 or 4 ads like that on different issues. When we showed them to the press, they laughed at us. He just did that to get publicity. We aired those ads, spent $100,000, which was a lot back then, and went up 12 points in the polls. And Arthur, when he gave the poll briefing, he looked at Tom Ellis and I, and he said, "It's time you two learn something new. This race isn't about liberal versus conservative. It's about Jim Hunt's character." The only line that worked in that ad was, "Where do you stand, Jim?" And that changed. It was a gift fell out of the sky into our laps. We didn't plan it. It just happened by chance. And that changed the whole direction of that campaign.
And that campaign
Sure.
ended up having all kinds of interesting ads. You
Right.
had Nicaraguan death squads
Right.
and all kinds of things.
Well, it was a wild campaign. We finally, in May of '84, we were something like 7 or 8 points behind. We'd gained that much, and I thought, well, I'm just going to bet the whole bank. And in June, I spent $1 million, and we ran ads about Hunt saying he was for Reagan's tax cuts, but showed him at the Republican Governors Association voting against them. Had it on videotape. End of June, we were even. And then this guy that owned a little newspaper, who was a Helms supporter, did a story that called Hunt sissy, prissy, and effeminate. And it was a complete slander. And Jesse denounced it, Tom Ellis denounced it. I canceled any ads we were running in his paper. But Jesse dropped huge. I mean, just the slander, the lie, backfired, even though it wasn't us.
Right.
And then Hunt put on that dead bodies ad, and that backfired on him. So we went from spending $1 million to get even, to we were 8 points behind again, and then Hunt ran that ad, and we were back even.
Wow.
One of the interesting points about the civility is that Gary Pierce was a huge Hunt guy, you were working for Helms, and then years later you all joined forces for that Talking About Politics blog.
Well, first time I met Gary was when we were negotiating the Helms Hunt debates. And there was ice in the room. I mean, I looked across the table and saw the devil, and he looked back and saw the devil. But during the negotiations, the Broadcasters Association, they wanted to have their anchormen ask the questions, handle the debates. And I said in one of the meetings, well, I think the candidates ought to ask each other the questions. And I saw Gary sort of smile. And I realized he agrees with me. So the second meeting we had, Tom Ellis asked the broadcasters, could y'all step out for a few minutes? And we worked it out with Phil and Gary, Phil Carlton and Gary, in about 5 minutes. Hunt would write questions, Jesse would write questions. They'd ask each other questions, and that was how the debate would be.
I like that.
And that was when we got, that's the first time I ever agreed with Gary on anything. And about 20 years later, we met by chance in a restaurant and started talking about politics and got to be friendly. And then somebody that we were working with in a campaign came and said, y'all ought to do a blog. I never heard of it. I said, what's a blog? And he explained it, and he had worked for John Dean. And I thought, okay, well, let's try that. So we did, and we've done it ever since.
Sure. How do we get back there? I mean, you know, there's been a lot of degradation in faith in the system, mistrust of politicians. I feel like we're at an all-time low. Do you think we are at an all-time low first? And how do we get back? How do we get people back engaged?
I think we are at an all-time low.
Right.
I think that we've gone into a state of decline.
Sure.
And I think the couple of things you got to focus on there. Number one, once people no longer put up with the stuff that's going on, that's when it'll stop. Right. That's the first requirement. And that it could take a crisis. Something happens that frightens people. All of a sudden, they start taking politics more seriously and say, okay, we got a problem, we got to deal with it or it's going to bite us. That makes them start looking for better political leadership and stop putting up with some of the foolishness. The second thing is the culture and the religion. If we had a religious rebirth, that would lead people to say, we can't put up with lies.
Right.
Other part of it is probably has to do with redistricting. Because, you know, a lot of races today, it's not a general election that matters. We've got 13 or 14 congressional districts in North Carolina. 13 of them are decided in primaries. Right. General elections don't matter. Have one where the general election matters. And so what you have today in the political parties is the primary voters on both sides decide the choices. And in the Republican Party, well, Republicans are roughly 30% of the voters, and roughly a third of them vote in primaries. So that's 10%. And they decide the choice for everybody else.
Sure.
So I think the redistricting's a piece of the problem. Not the biggest piece, but a piece.
Very interesting. All right. Well, so where do you see us going in 2025? North Carolina, of course, very red in some areas, very blue in others, but purple. Where does this take us? What's the future for us, you think?
Well, in the future, one thing I've learned in politics.
Crystal ball's not always clear.
No, the unseen hand always moves,
Sure.
The unexpected happens, and that can change everything, like the Iran hostage crisis.
Right.
So I wouldn't predict the future, but I would say this. Normally, after a president gets elected, 2 years later you have an off-year election where he gets clobbered. And if Trump stumbles, it could be a pretty severe clobbering. You know, I remember Reagan got elected in '80, first time I ever saw an off-year election. And I thought, well, you know, we'd won in '76 in the Reagan primary. We'd elected Helms in '80. We'd elected John Easton Reagan in '80, Helms in '78. I thought, we got this down. We understand it. And we lost every congressional race in '82. So that could happen and change it. But I think a lot of it's just going to depend on how good Trump does in the White House. And if he bungles, you'll get a huge kickback.
Very interesting.
On the state level, given that you tend to see the pendulum swing back, and after a Republican candidate wins or the Democrat candidate, they lose the next time around. Is it incumbent on the people who are in charge to build in some safeguards so that, hey, you know, the next time around, the people want to go the other way, we don't want to be in the position of not being able to have any influence and not being able to do anything. We should make it so that the minority party at least has a role.
Well, I'm not sure. You're talking about what they're doing now.
Right.
They're passing a lot of laws that are restructuring the power in the government. I think there's some fundamental problems with that. I mean, I hate to say this, but I've become a great fan of gridlock. I think, you know, when you got two parties both heading in the wrong direction, gridlock's a blessing.
Right.
And when one party can change the rules in such a way that they get more power, you get less gridlock. I think that's bad. I used to think when Reagan was president, I thought gridlock was terrible. But eventually I watched some professor talking on TV, and I thought, well, that's why the founders put that in the Constitution that way. And it's really one of the things that protects us.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time
thank
here.
you.
Trail of the Serpent, you can find it on Amazon.
Yes, Amazon's the best place to buy it.
Fantastic. It's a great, it's a great history of North Carolina politics, but national politics too. So
Yes.
yeah, good little Christmas gift, certainly. All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the Debrief. We will see you again, I guess, in 2025.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Thanks.